Hey, Steven, I figured a video walkthrough will be the fastest way to get you up to speed on how these config files work, so that's what I've done here. I've put together a small project, which I've sent to you as a zip file, and what I'm recommending is this structure for when you export a pen from CodePen, and just a project folder, right, that houses the config file, and then two subfolders, build and source. And then all the files that you would export from CodePen would actually go into the source folder. So I have an index.html, a scripts folder with a main.js, and a styles folder with a main.scss file. And I know you guys support a bunch of different languages, so these could be whatever you'd like. And if you have like multiple JS files, they could all go here, that kind of thing. But I do recommend the overall structure of source and build, because what that'll let you do is just tell your users, hey, when you download it from CodePen, drop it onto CodeKit, and then just click the build project button, and everything will be built right in the build folder. You don't need to ship the build folder with whatever you export from CodePen. This doesn't need to exist. CodeKit will create it. All you need to do is create the source folder. But what it does is just kind of give really good separation and organization to the project, right? So there's not output files mixed in with input files. It's real clear that the output files are always in the build folder. Anything in the source folder is an input file, right? It just makes it super easy to intuit what's going on in the project. So I really recommend this structure rather than, say, compiling main.js to main-min.js right next door to the input file. That gets a little confusing, especially for novice users. So I do recommend this structure. And what I've done is gone ahead and boiled down the config file to just what I think you should ship, right? What you should export from CodePen. So the way CodeKit works is every line in this config file, except for two entries that it uses to validate that it is actually a config file, are optional. And if a setting is missing from the config file, CodeKit will go and pull it from the defaults that the user has set in the app. And if they haven't changed those defaults are what I ship CodeKit with when they first install the app. So every setting has a backup that CodeKit will pull from. So all the settings are optional. They don't need to be in here. So what I've done is define just the settings I think you should override to ensure that they are the way you want them, and then let CodeKit inherit all the other stuff that you don't need to worry about. So for example, here's what the config file looks like when CodeKit actually exports it, when it writes it to disk. And you'll notice in the files object, there's an entry for every single file in the project. And they have these abbreviated keys here. They're abbreviated because with projects with tens of thousands of files, using the full name actually added, tens of megabytes to the size of the config file. So I just abbreviate stuff to cut down on the amount of boilerplate text in the config file for big projects. But every file have an entry here, but you don't need to create those because CodeKit will go ahead and create these for you using the project settings that you supply. So I've eliminated those. And if you scroll down, you'll see things like Babel plugins, a long list of Babel plugins, which ones are active. That doesn't need to be there, right? CodeKit will regenerate that for you from project settings. And then, further down, you get into ESLint rules and all kinds of stuff. So it all adds up real quick. And again, we can just drop all of that and CodeKit will use the defaults that are in the app. So what I've done is taken the config file and boiled it down to a much more manageable size. And now it's just, I think, about 200 lines, and all of those are just project setting properties. The reality is that CodeKit just does so many things that there's a lot to configure. There's a lot of options. You guys, I don't think use Babel on CodePen right now, so you could technically just drop all the Babel settings from project settings, and CodeKit would inherit those again. But I left them in because that way you can control the defaults, and override whatever the user might have as their defaults, so you get a little more control over what the actual project comes into CodeKit with. But what I've done is drop all of the file stuff that's now just an empty object, and CodeKit will recreate those. And dropped a bunch of the ESLint rules, so those are gone. Coffee lint flags, those are gone. Those will all be pulled in from the defaults on the machine. So you don't need to worry about all that stuff. It really shortens the config file. There's a couple of things I do recommend that you take a look at in the project's attributes object right here. There's display value, and that's the name of the project as it appears in the UI. You can set this to whatever you want. If the pen has a particular name on CodePen, you might drop that in here. But what you'll also want to set, if you do that, is display value was set by user. Change this to 1. It's just an integer boolean. And what this will do is lock that as the name of the project. if display value is set by user is 0, then CodeKit will sync the display value to whatever the name of the folder is on disk. So the first time a user manually sets a name in the UI, this gets set to 1, and then the name is locked. It will no longer stay in sync with the folder name on disk. So you might want to do that. And then the other thing that I recommend you take a look at are in the project settings object, right? You have, a bunch of stuff here, like auto prefixer, enable IE grid. So that turns on the IE grid option for auto prefixer. The auto prefixer is a tool you guys use. Babel is all here, so you can configure that. You'll probably be interested in the browser's list string option right here. I ship with this default, but whatever you guys are using on the website to power, excuse me, auto prefixer, you might want to customize the browser's list string here. This is also used for Babel, which by default is set to use Babel preset environment to auto configure itself to match whatever browsers you've specified here. The next thing you'll probably want to take a look at here is language defaults. So there's a bunch of objects here: language defaults coffee, language defaults CSS. There's one for each type of file that CodeKit has built-in processing for. And these are the backstop where settings come from for new files that CodeKit discovers in the project. So anything that's not already got a object in the files object up here for a given file, right? If CodeKit can't find a setting or an entry for that file in this, it'll go down here and use these language defaults to decide, all right, what option should this file have initially. So, if we scroll down there in alphabetical order here, so if we just scroll down to SAS, which is coming up right here, you can see, for example, the debug style is currently set to 0. Decimal precision 10, should run auto prefixer. That's a Boolean. Auto prefixer's on, so it's 1. You could set this to 0, if you wanted auto prefixer to be off based on whatever the user has, configured in the CodePen website. So this is where you would come for SAS files to set auto prefixer. There's another one of these objects for less with the exact same key, should run auto prefixer. So this is what you would adjust when you're exporting this file to decide whether auto prefixer should run. And then the stuff at the top here, these auto output path options are shared. Yeah, every entry here, every language defaults entry has these same keys. And what these control is what happens to the file when it changes or builds. That's the auto output action, right? 0 means compile or process. I think 1 is ignore and 2 is copy. This is all in the documentation that I've put together for you. And then these options, auto output path, file name pattern, for example, matches up with the CodeKit UI. If you come into project settings and then choose a language like SAS there, scroll down to the output path options, you'll see output file name star.css, right? So we're going to name the SAS file star.css. We could do something like star-min.css, but I really recommend the clean option, which is just take whatever the extension is, .scss, and compile that to the same file name .css. Don't add any suffixes or anything. And that makes it real easy in your index.html file, right? You don't have to remember, once the project is built, the JS file is going to be named, main-min.js. You don't have to remember that. You can just say, well, my JavaScript file is named main.js. And then the one in the build folder will be minified and possibly transpiled and all that stuff, but it's still just main.js. So I've set those sensible defaults already in the config file. Everything is set to compile and then mirror into the build folder. Whatever the path is in the source folder, it'll just be mirrored into the build folder. And then everything just has the star dot and the appropriate extension. So SAS goes to CSS, less goes to CSS, JavaScript, same deal. It's just going to compile, and I have it set to minify, by default when the JavaScript is processed, but it's just going to be whatever the file name is, .js, mirrored into the build folder. So all of these are set for you with sane defaults for working with build folders, but if you wanted to customize any of this, this is where you come to do it. And then these like auto output path, replace 1 and replace 2, that pairs up with the replace this part of the input path. So this is auto output path replace 1 is this text field value. This is auto output path replace 2, right? And then auto output path relative path is, this right here, the relative path. And then relative to is going to be the auto output path style right here, 0, right? So that's 0, and then 1 would be the project's build folder. So, those are the options that pair up down here. But like I said, these are all set with sane defaults already. So I recommend you use those, and everything is just going to compile into the build folder. So when your user gets the project exported from CodePen and they get it on their machine, all they have to do is drag it onto the app window and then hit build project and then hit preview, and that'll bring up the project, in Safari here. And, my index.html is just a little hello world page. So that's all they have to do to get up and running and start tweaking locally. And so the build folder setup really makes it super nice and separated and all that. So that's the only stuff I recommend that you take a look at are these language defaults for each, language that you support. CodeKit has a bunch of stuff in here that I don't think CodePen supports yet, like SVGs and things, optimizing GIFs and JPEGs and PNGs. All of those are in here. Markdown, so there's a bunch of stuff here that you may not want to address, and you optionally can just, if you don't want this markdown thing in here, you can just delete this. And again, CodeKit will pull the markdown settings from, the user's machine. The reason I left all of these language defaults in here is because by having them in here, you control that everything in that source folder is going to mirror into the build folder. It's possible if you don't specify, like if you just deleted markdown here and the user has different settings for markdown in their new project defaults, right? So they go into CodeKit and up here and edit defaults for new projects. You can come in here and tell CodeKit, hey, when I add a project to the app that doesn't have a config file, here's what I want to do with all these different languages. So, if you don't specify it explicitly, you'll inherit whatever the user has specified, and that may not match up with the build folder setting and, mirroring into the build folder. So I think it's a better story for you guys to just control all of that and make sure it's locked down, the way you want it to be, so that the project builds correctly and the user doesn't have to, worry about any of their settings conflicting with the way you've structured the project. So I would just leave all the language defaults in here. And then as you export from CodePen, just language default Sass, match up the settings that you need for how you have the Sass compiler configured on CodePen. There is one thing in here, use libsass. I would leave this enabled, right? CodeKit has libsass, and I think you guys are compiling with Node Sass, which is backed by libsass. So we're probably using the same compiler there. If this is 0, then, CodeKit falls back to the legacy Sass compiler, and libsass is just much better. So I would leave that enabled. And otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. The things besides language defaults in here, are just options that are pretty easy to understand exactly what they do. So browser refresh delay, for example, it's a number of seconds, 0 to 10. Build folder name. If you wanted to customize what the build folder is named, that's right here. The default is build, but you can name it whatever you want. And same with source folder name. By default it's source, but if you use like src, the source folder is down here somewhere. Source folder name right there, so you can customize that. Things like that. So if you do customize the build folder name, you'll also want to set the web root. So that's going to be website relative root right here at the bottom. And this tells the preview server where to serve from. And this should match whatever you name the build folder. When you change it in CodeKit, CodeKit knows to automatically update this property in the config file. But when you change it manually, you'll need to remember to adjust the website relative root to match whatever your build folder name is. So definitely, make sure that one's in there. And then a bunch of TypeScript options are down here. So that's the one exception, is TypeScript has so many configuration options that what I do is a few of them are available on a file by file basis, which is going to be up here in the language defaults TS. Create a source map, minify, what kind of module resolution to use, remove comments, the target script version, all that's here. And then most TypeScript options are actually at the project settings level, so if you wanted to adjust any of them, here is where they go. And these match up with just the TypeScript documentation, allow synthetic default imports. So I'm not a TypeScript expert, but all of the TypeScript options are available, so you can adjust them here. A lot of them are booleans, and then some of them are styles. And that's another thing, is just anytime I have like a module type or a style, like an output style, in stylus here. I think there's like, yeah, output style or debug style. These are going to be non-Boolean options, and each integer corresponds to one of the debug styles that stylus supports. And these are documented at that file I have going for you. I've sent you this link. If you just pull all this up and then jump to the language that you want to look at, say like less, in the files object that we deleted, we got rid of when we shortened the config file. In the files object, all of those names are going to be shortened, like we discussed, and these match up with those. But if you just scroll down here and find OS, output style, here are the values. So if you pass 0, it's going to be regular, and if you pass 1, it's going to be compressed, right? And then less has that rewrite URLs option, and again, the value you pass is going to match up with these options from the less compiler. So just anytime something's named type or style, that kind of thing, it's not a Boolean value. It's going to be something that matches up here from one of these, and that's pretty much all you need to worry about when you export the config file. And then, like I said, CodeKit will regenerate everything else that's missing or not included in here. And you'll be set to go. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'm more than happy to answer anything. And I am going to continue working on this document. I've started going through project settings and kind of elaborating on what each of these things is, so that you have some information to work on in case you want to adjust any of them. But if something's missing from here or I haven't gotten to it yet, let me know. And yeah, super excited. So thanks very much. Take care.